So last week we had our penultimate speaker.
Very nicely done.
I had to say that for Rhonda.
I love it.
So today we have our ultimate speaker. Also the final speaker for the semester, in many ways also the ultimate in terms of the quality of scholarship that is emanating from this program of research. And before I give a brief introduction to Francesca Gino, our speaker for today, first of all I want to say welcome to Chapter Hill, Francesca. It sounds strange because Dr. Gino, Francesca is a professor here in the School of Business, Kenan-Flagler. She's in the Faculty of Organizational Behavior. And it's strange for me to say welcome to Chapel Hill. That's because she's been jet-setting around the world for the last couple of months. Her research has been getting so much international, national attention. So a few days ago, I got an email from her saying, hi from Pittsburgh. Last week it was hi from Philadelphia. A couple of weeks before that it was London. Before that it was the Netherlands. Before that it was California. So we are pleased to have her back in Chapel Hill so that she can come and talk to us today. So Francesca is a native of Italy and got her master's and PhD in economics and business at the Santa Anita Institute of Advanced Studies in Pisa, Italy, and then came to Harvard and spent a couple of years there as a postdoc scholar, and then went as a visiting professor to Carnegie Mellon, and then we were fortunate enough to get her here at Kenan-Flagler. And for the short time that she's been here, she's established a great Colloquium series there. Sometimes I've sent out some of the reminders. I know that there's a great talk coming up next Tuesday. Adam Delinsky is going to be talking there. I know some of you are going to be there. And also set up one of the few people doing experimental research in her program as well. And she was just talking about how she doesn't have enough kindred spirits. And I said, just move over to this building. So we have all that happening. And her research is really looking at so many different aspects of interpersonal influences as they span so many different areas too, in terms of looking at conflict, negotiation, identity, and looking at all these factors in terms of especially how they affect decision making. So really some really interesting work in behavioral decision making. And her research record, her publication record is pretty humbling. I'm trying to keep up in touch with her articles, and I say, okay, I just finished reading this, and then you go back to her page, and then it's 6 more in press. So it's a bit difficult. It's been pretty much published in all the top journals and organized and behavioral decision making, psychological science, and management as well. So one of the program research has been looking at all the factors that influence how we behave ethically or unethically, and I'm glad that she's going to talk to us about that today.
Thank you so much for this wonderful introduction that I'm not quite sure I deserve. So I'm really happy to be here today. I should have done certainly this sooner, and I'm sorry I missed my date in September. I am viewing this presentation also as a way to start a discussion potentially and raise your interest in some of the topics that I've been researching about. And it's true, we do have a lab and a subject pool at the business school, and if you are interested in running studies there, I'd be happy to hear from you because we're a little bit lonely on that. So today I'm going to talk about some of the research I've been doing on the effect of others' behavior on our own, and specifically we're going to be looking at ethical decision making, so the context of ethics. Now, I've been interested in ethical decision making for a while, and when I started working on this topic, people were asking me a lot of questions about my motivation for studying ethical and unethical decision making. And I think nowadays I have a much easier case in terms of motivating my research, so I could have another very different slide just talking about cases of corporate corruption. So we are all obviously very familiar with them. Enron is one of them, but also outside of the United States, we have Parmalat and many others. But what I'm going to focus about today is a different set of behaviors. That are the type of behaviors that are represented up here. And if you look at this slide, there are a couple of things that I would like to note. First of all, these are really individual behaviors. So one interesting one up here is wardrobing. So before coming to the United States, I didn't even know what that was. Turns out that a lot of people actually, it accounts for $16 billion, according to a recent estimate. So people buy their clothing and then they bring it back as if they were to say that they didn't wear the clothes in the first place. And there is actually quite an interesting research stream behind that topic, and I discovered that a friend of mine not only she buys clothes, but she also has and then she brings them back, but she also has a machine that allows her to put the label back on the dress. So I think it's a phenomenon that is quite widespread, and we have quite a few examples up there. And as I said, a couple of interesting things about this slide. First of all, it's not just a matter of corporate corruption, but we have a lot of individual dishonest behavior going on. And it's not only socially relevant, but it's also relevant from an economic standpoint. These numbers up here are really quite big. And these are recent estimates, and the numbers are not getting any better. So today's talk is really going to focus on individual dishonest behavior. Now, if you don't believe the numbers, we can look into the research, and there is a lot of research suggesting that people do engage in unethical behavior more often than they think they do. So, for example, there is some research showing that we tell lies on a regular basis. But then when you ask people whether they see themselves as moral and whether they care about being good people, they do say that they do. So usually on a scale of 1 to 5, you're around 4.2, which is quite high. So this suggests that there is room to try to understand when and why people cross ethical boundaries. And a lot of my research over the last few years has focused on that. And I'm not particularly interested in studying the behavior of criminals. I think there is a lot of unethical behavior in the field that is intentional, but I'm actually interested in looking at people like us and see what situational factors can make us cross ethical boundaries. And in certain cases, we might not even be aware of that. So there are obviously lots of behaviors that we might engage in. So common ones are inflating expenses or cheating on taxes, or in the case of doctors and lawyers, it could be overcharging clients if you think about billing by the hour. So as I said, the idea is to try to understand what happens to these good people, and why is that even good people cross ethical boundaries. Now, I have research that look at different factors, and today I'm just going to focus on the behavior of others and see when and how the behavior of other people lead us to cross ethical boundaries. I'm cherry picking, I'm presenting studies from various papers, and if you're interested in reading more about those, there is a science paper in collaboration with Shahar, Ayal, and then Ariely. Then Ariely is a professor at Junck, and if you haven't had the chance to interact with him, I suggest you do. He's a great person. And Shahar is also a wonderful researcher who's been working with Ariely over the last 3 years. And the second set of studies actually comes from a different paper in collaboration with a few colleagues from the University of Toronto, Junck and Chambo. And the last paper that I'm going to talk about is research in progress. So any thought you might have, we might be running studies, more studies in the future, and this is actually with Ayal, who's coming here on Tuesday. So let me tell you a little bit more about the theory behind this idea of how other people's behavior could influence us. And when we started thinking about the influence of others' behavior, we started thinking about various mechanisms. So the first one could be related to a cost-benefit analysis. So this is a mechanism that makes us think about rational crime theory, and the idea that we are selfish individuals, and as long as the benefits that we get from cheating are bigger than the cost, then we might be more likely to engage in unethical behavior. So from these ideas, given that we run a lot of studies where maybe the probability of getting caught is not as high, if we give financial rewards to people, you might expect, according to these theories, that people are going to engage in unethical behavior. There is actually some very beautiful research by Dan and some of his colleagues showing that there are other factors that enter into our mind as we think about engaging in ethical behavior that are not related to these costs and benefits. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And by the way, just as a norm, you can interrupt me with questions at any point. So this is the first mechanisms that we thought about, and there is some evidence suggesting that people do engage in this cost-benefit analysis in other contexts. The second about saliency. So in this case, you could imagine that if you make people more aware of ethical standards, they might be thinking more carefully about engaging in ethical behavior, and as a result of it, they might be less likely to act
quick
dishonestly.
question.
Yes.
So when you talk about the rational model, how does that relate to, or is there any relation to Bandura's social learning, for example? Because so much of what you point out there seems to be in terms of, the perceived rewards or punishments. So if you see the perceived rewards, then you would act out that behavior. But if you see that there are perceived punishments, you refrain from acting out those behaviors, right?
That's right. And actually, you mentioned the research over lunch. What I was thinking about is that social learning actually speaks also to the third mechanism that I haven't thought about. So, and we mentioned that in the paper, the fact that you are observing others' behavior and you're reacting to that behavior. And there are conditions where you might follow and conditions where you might not follow. So I would see it more related to the social norms than to the cost-benefit analysis. Even seeing that another person or other people are not getting caught for their dishonest behaviors, for example, could be useful information that you might feed back into the cost-benefit analysis model. So in a sense, it affects all the three mechanisms, but I think most so for the social norm mechanism that I'm going to touch on in just 1 second.
So,
yeah, sure.
So in all your studies or your colleagues, other people have done who have tested this, have you looked at self-efficacy as a potential variable? Because I can think about if I have high levels of self-efficacy, then irrespective of whatever the manipulation would be, I would be extremely ethical. But if my levels of efficacy were quite weak or low, then that would have a substantial interaction with my, depending on the experimental condition I'm assigned to, which would then predict.
Right. So I have many different answers for that question. So in this particular research, no, we haven't measured self-efficacy, and it is relevant given that the type of task that we use are tasks that are competence-based, so that they require some competence on the part of the participants. But there is a project that I started that looks at how is cheating different in cases in which there is a competence component versus not. So for example, there is a beautiful book called The Cheating Culture, and it started in the preface with quite a powerful cheating culture. With a powerful example. And the example is, suppose I call you up, we're good friends, and I call you up one day and I say, hey, I just finished filling out my taxes, and I'm so happy because I was able to just inflate my numbers a little bit, and I saved $1,000. I think you might put down the phone and say, clever, maybe next time I see her, I'm going to ask her how she did it. But if I were to call you up and say, hey, I was just at the grocery store and I shoplifted, and maybe it's not for $1,000, but it's like $200, I think you would have a very different reaction to my unethical behavior. So I think we have a project that starts to get at that question of what happens when the context we're in requires ability versus not. And I think it's a fascinating question. On that one, I also want to mention another project that suggests that maybe it's easier for people to justify their behavior when we're in a context where competence and ability are on the table as well. So we've done some research, this is in collaboration with Ariely and Mike Norton at Harvard, where we look at self-deception. So you can imagine a study where people come in and we have two very simple conditions. In one condition, I ask you some general questions and you have a question per page. And in the second condition, not only you have the question on the page, but you also have the answer at the bottom of the page. Now, when you're at the end of the 10th question, I ask you to tell me how many you got right. Maybe not surprisingly, people in the answer condition tell you that they got 6 or 7 right, and the other ones tell you that they got 2 or 3. But the more interesting part is that if you ask them to predict their performance on a similar set of questions, like 100 of them, then the people in the answer condition, and they know that the next set of questions is going to be without the answers, tell you that they're going to get 75 right, and the people in the no-answer condition are more like 30. So there is I think, when competence and ability is on the table, I think people have a very easy time justifying their action and believing that they're better than they actually are, and that they're more competent than they actually are. And we're doing some follow-up on that, trying to understand when it happens and when it does not. Okay, so going back to this set of influences. So in the case of saliency, the idea is that if I make ethicality salient, you're going to be thinking more critically about your own ethical standards. And there is some research supporting that saliency does work in reducing unethical behavior. So for example, to mention it again, Dan has done some work looking at what happens when you ask people to read and sign an honor code prior to a task where they have the opportunity to cheat, and show that in fact when people are signing and reading the honor code, they're less likely to cheat because this honor code brings saliency in terms of ethical standards. And this also happens when you ask them, for example, to recall the 10 Commandments. So even if people don't actually remember what the 10 Commandments are, these bring the ethicality salient to their mind. So it could well be that if you see another person cheat, that behavior brings to you, makes the importance of ethicality more salient, and so as a result, you're likely not to engage in unethical behavior. Now, a third type of influence is related to this idea of social norm. So there is a lot of research. Social learning is actually one of the research streams that talks about how we are affected by the behavior of others. Cialdini has done some incredible and very nice work also on the effect of norms, distinguishing between descriptive and injunctive type of norms. So norms that define the behavior that most people engage in, and also norms that describe the behavior that people tend to approve on. Now, if we think more carefully about this idea of social norms, what we can say is that depending on how strongly people identify with the group or the person engaging in ethical behavior, we might have different behavior on the part observing unethical behavior. So we know, for example, that people are affected by the behavior of others differently if these others are in-group and out-group members, and there is a sweet spot for our in-group members. So what we argue with this third mechanism is that maybe even in the context of ethics, we are affected in similar ways. So if we see an in-group member engaging in ethical behavior, then it could be that we are likely to follow, but if the person is an out-group member, then we want to distance ourselves from that person and that behavior. So if we summarize the prediction of these mechanisms, we are actually having to talk about three different types of effects. So in the cost-benefit analysis, the idea is that independent from who the person cheating is, you're going to expect cheating if the rewards are bigger than the cost, and as long as we keep the probability of being caught low, as we do in our study, we might observe cheating. The second hypothesis is this hypothesis about making ethical standards more salient, and so in this case we would expect a reduction in cheating. And the third one is the one that distinguishes between this social identity mechanism by which if the person cheating is an in-group member, we might expect to follow the actions of this person, and if the person is an out-group member, then we might expect people not to follow that behavior. So in order to test these different mechanisms, we went into the lab. And I should tell you that some of my research is field research, but for today, you're going to see only lab data. So I'm sorry if I'm disappointing you on that dimension. So in this case, we ran a first study, a very simple study, in which we used a problem-solving task that people were asked to complete under time pressure. So this is the type of material that people received, and as you can see, there are different matrices, and each of them is constructed in such a way that you're able to find only a pair of numbers that sum up to 10. So people are asked to work fast and try to find the either self-score or the experimenter check their own work. So we had 4 conditions. The first one is the control condition. So in this case, they would do their task for 5 minutes, and then at the end, they would bring the task to the piece of paper to the experimenter, and have the experimenter actually go over their matrices and check their scores. We had a Schroeder condition in which participants worked on the matrix task for 5 minutes. Then they had a collection slip. We asked them to fill out the collection slip and then shred their task. So we had no evidence of what they actually did. And then we had a similar condition in which we added a confederate. And this was actually an actor. At that time we ran the studies that was at Kenan-Flagler University. And this was an actor that was asked to stand up after the first 60 seconds of the task. And that's clearly not enough time to complete everything. And he would say, I've sold everything, what should I do? And the experimenter would reply, sorry?
Said what?
I've sold everything, what should I do? So at that point, the experimenter said, well, if you sold everything, you can just take your money and go. And we set up the study so that the money was actually in an envelope on their desk so that they didn't even need to go back to the experimenter to get their money. So what we varied in this case was whether the confederate was an in-group or an out-group member. So these were sessions with about 15, 20 people. So big sessions where everybody in the session was a student from Kenan-Flagler University. And if you've been to Pittsburgh, you would know that people have a sense of rivalry with the people with the students from the University of Pittsburgh. It's a little bit like Duke and UNC when we talk about basketball or football. So in the case of the in-group member condition, the person was wearing regular clothing, and in the case of an out-group confederate condition, the person was actually wearing a t-shirt of the University of Pittsburgh. Now, what we're interested in looking at is the performance on the task, the problem-solving task that we used. Now, as I said here, we are shredding their test, so we are looking at differences in mean performance. In the case of the control condition, this was checked by the experimenter. In the case of the shredder condition, it was reported. So by looking at this first comparison, what we can say is that when people are given the opportunity to cheat, they do engage in unethical behavior, and they do misreport their performance and tend to cheat. Yes?
Were they paid more the better they did?
Oh, sorry, that's actually an important component. Yes, so they were paid 50 cents for each matrix sold correctly.
Okay.
So they had a $2 fee, so the maximum payment was $10 plus to $12. Yeah. And this, as you can imagine, is a very quick study. So they stayed in the lab probably.
So it's still not very much money.
Mm-hmm. That's right. That's right.
But it's
That's
enough
right.
to motivate.
That's right. Yeah. And I've done some research, and others have done some research that show that incentives matter, but not as much as you think they would. Now, an interesting thing is that if I were to show you the distribution of the people and their scores as self-reported in the shredder condition, you wouldn't see a lot of people saying 20. So people do tend to cheat, but not all the way. They cheat by a little bit. And this is actually consistent across many of the different studies that I conducted. And Ariely actually calls that a fudge factor. So it's true that we care about being good people, and so we're willing to cheat, but just by a little bit, so that we don't have to change our idea of how good we are. Now, more interestingly, let's look at the shredder plus in-group and out-group condition. So when we look at the shredder plus in-group condition, we see that the self-reported performance goes up. So what we are able to say is that cheating is actually higher when there is a confederate who's an in-group member. And when we have an out-group member, the cheating goes down. And interestingly enough, it goes down, but it's not as little as you might expect. So there is still some cheating going on when there is the confederate who's an out-group member, but it's almost no cheating. So this is just the first study showing that there doesn't seem to be evidence for this cost-benefit analysis, because we wouldn't expect differences across the Schroeder conditions. There also seem not to be support for the saliency hypothesis, but there seems to be some support for our idea of social norms driving unethical behavior. Now, in the manipulation that we used in this first study, we confounded a little bit this social norm hypothesis with the saliency hypothesis. So having a person that after 60 seconds stands up and says, I'm done with everything, is really bringing into people's mind that it's okay to cheat and cheating might be salient. So, in a sense, we argue that that saliency worked against our case because you could imagine that cheating is possible, so I tend not to cheat, but we decided to run a second study to see if there is something to that explanation also. So in this case, we use the same type of task, and we're still trying to solve puzzles under time pressure. And what we did, we just used 3 different conditions. So the first one is the control condition, as in the first study. We had a Schroeder condition, again, as in the first study. And then the new condition was a Schroeder plus confederate condition in which we just wanted to bring ethicality to people's mind. So the confederate, as the experimenter was reading the instruction, just said, so is it okay to cheat? Right at the beginning. And so we used this manipulation to bring to people's attention the fact that it was possible to cheat. So we would expect cheating to be lower if this saliency mechanism was working. Yes?
What was the answer?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the experimenter said you can do whatever you like.
Okay.
Yeah, my question was also with the saliency hypothesis. Does that sort of assume that the default is that people would err on the side of cheating unless honesty, ethicality is made more salient, or is there a valence sort of on both sides that it's, cheating can also be sort of made more salient?
Saw it, right?
So it's a very good question. So I was just at a conference in Philadelphia where there was a presentation on the effect of automaticity, and there was a lot of discussion around, so are we claiming that people are by default self-interested, and if the probability of being caught is really low, people do cheat? So I don't think there is a clear answer to that. But I think there is enough evidence to suggest that people really care about having this positive self-image also when it comes to ethics. So they want to believe they're good people and they're ethical people. But if you ask them, give them the opportunity to cheat, they do seem to have the self-interested automatic response, by only a little bit, so that this self-image does not change. So for example, I read some studies where we ask people to engage in tasks that are depleting. So we were looking at the effect of ego depletion, and this literature suggests that we have a general resource in ourselves, and as we go through our day and we engage in difficult tasks, we deplete this resource. And so what we see is that compared to a control condition, when people are depleted, they tend to be more likely to engage in unethical behavior. So I think there is some evidence to that extent, but I don't want to go as far as saying by default we are unethical people, because I'm not sure I want to claim that, and I'm not sure I believe in that statement. And there are also lots of good studies out there that suggest that in a moment of crisis or emergencies, our default behavior is actually helping another person. So, okay. So in this case, we replicate by comparing the Schroeder and the control condition, we replicate the effect that we saw before. So once again, if people are given the opportunity to cheat, they seem to take that opportunity and engage in unethical behavior. And when we have saliency, so we're bringing this ethicality to the attention of participants, then there is a reduction in the level of cheating. So from these 2 studies, it seems like we have some evidence for supporting our idea of social norms as an influence of how others react to the behavior of their peers, but there is also some evidence that this saliency mechanism is very powerful, and this is consistent with previous research. Now, if we try to interpret the results of study 1, then it seems that if our manipulation was in fact confounded and we were both raising the level of saliency and also the level of feelings of in-groups, then we would expect even worse results in terms of cheating, meaning higher level of cheating if just the in-group and out-group mechanism was playing its role by itself. So this is evidence, as I said, that is suggestive of the fact that if we were to observe others' unethical behavior, and this other unethical behavior was behavior of people we consider in-group, we will be more likely to follow their behavior. And there is certainly a lot of evidence in the real world that suggests that this is in fact the case. So there are the tortures and humiliations in the stories that we heard recently about certainly speak to that. And we also have some evidence from Wall Street. So this is actually an email that was sent among peers in 2006, saying that so we're wealthy and retired by the time this house of cards falters, suggesting that there were people within the same group actually engaging in unethical behavior. And maybe they did influence one another just because they were part of the same group. Now, there is also evidence out there suggesting that this is not the way we react to people's behavior when we see something wrong happening. So there is beautiful research, for example, suggesting that if we think about the past behavior of our peers, and this past behavior was bad, then we would feel guilty about it. We would feel a sense of associated guilt. So for example, think about the Germans thinking about the Holocaust. So this brings back bad memories in a sense, and you have this sense of associated guilt. So our argument is that maybe there is a moderating effect here, and there might be evidence for the fact that when out-group members are present, we behave in different ways. So if you think back to the two studies that I just showed you, these were studies where everybody in the room was a Carnegie Mellon student. And so people maybe felt that they were part of a group where everybody was an in-group member. And in this case, we did see that people were likely to imitate the behavior of their in-group members, and when they saw an out-group member, they were likely to distance themselves from it. But what if, instead of having in-group observers, we had both in-group and out-group observers? And one of the examples that I like to use is an example, is something that actually I experienced. Imagine being out for dinner with Italians like me, but also people from the United States. And as it happens, in Italy, you're not supposed to tip, but in the United States, it's not actually appropriate to tip, it's the norm. And I had a friend of mine who really decided that tipping was not a good idea and didn't tip when we had to pay for our meal. And so as a result of it, everybody was seeing the behavior, I felt guilty, and I compensated by tipping more than the 20%. So this is a case where we had both in-group and out-group observers, and in this case, maybe the type of norm that my friend was trying to spread become more salient and more important in my mind because there are people from the United States watching. And the fact that it's not only a dinner with Italian, but also dinner with people from the United States, I might be thinking about where I belong more carefully. And the fact that I'm Italian might be a little bit more salient into my mind. And as a result, I would feel guilty for my in-group members' inappropriate behavior.
Did you compensate silently, or did you?
I didn't say anything, and I overcompensated silently. Yes. Yeah. And it's a good question. We, in the studies here, we don't distinguish between silent and behavior that is
Bring it to the
so
floor.
in essence, there are silent.
Is there a complication using tipping? Because I know it's considered the norm, but yet there's also this idea that it's voluntary. mean that I don't tip. So don't even think that. But is it fair to call someone who doesn't tip a bad apple?
No. So I'm using that as an example because I actually think, and I might be wrong here, but I think that in the United States the norms are strong.
Strong enough that
I think it's known that people don't receive a very high salary because they
rely on
do things
tips.
as their own tip.
And it's not that way in Italy?
No. So in Italy, you never tip. And you actually have great stories of Italian people moving to the United States, like tipping the policeman because you don't understand the norms and sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. But it's in general in Italy you don't tip unless you really want to, but it's very unusual.
We bribe our policemen, we don't tip.
We do that too.
Yeah, we pay before the service, not after.
Right.
That's right, that's right. Yeah, when I was in Italy, I used to put my money into my driver's license, which is really a bad idea because when they stop you, that's the first thing that they do, and they see the money and they think it's you're trying to bribe them. So I had some problems with that. Okay, so we wanted to explore this idea that maybe there is a reversal in the fact that we observed in study 1 and study 2, and so we tried to explore that reversal. So we designed a study in which we looked at the effect of an in-group selfish example versus an out-group selfish example. This is actually a study that was conducted at UNC, so instead of having CMU at the University of Pittsburgh, here we're using UNC t-shirts versus Duke t-shirts. So in this case, we had people come to the lab, and we have 2 rooms, one next to the other, and we had some people enter one room and some people enter another room. And we asked them to answer an initial questionnaire that we just used to make sure that people would walk away with some money. After that, we had people engage in a Dictator Game, and this is a very simple a game where people need to allocate $10. So if I'm the allocator, I just need to decide how much money to give to Shri, and I can give anything from $0 to $10. And usually in these games, there are strong norms of fairness. Maybe people don't give 5, but they think of that as a fair offer. Yes?
Broader question really, but is there any reason which looks at, when we talk about in-groups as out groups, in terms of looking at it in terms of polar opposites, so we always look at it in terms of Michigan, Ohio State, Pitt, Carnegie Mellon, UNC Duke. So what would happen, for example, in terms of you have someone wearing a UNC shirt, someone wearing a Duke shirt, but someone wearing a Pitt shirt, right? And that'd still be an out group, but then,
it's not a hated out.
it's not, yeah, so it's not.
It's a good question. So I might address it in the last series of studies, but maybe not in an excellent way. We'll see if you're happy with it. I think my sense is that you might find the same effect, but maybe there are a little bit not as big differences. But we'll see if I address that with the reason I'm presenting later. Yes?
What are your thoughts about the out-group kind of being seen as a second or third class individual or group of people? I'm thinking of the racism studies, those where the out-group is really seen as somebody who's truly beneath you, and whereas there might be some individuals here who think of Dukies as being truly beneath them. I don't I don't know if it's you know what I mean, like in exactly the same way as people who are.
They're just others versus inferior.
Yeah, like where the out-group member is seen as truly inferior to.
So it's an interesting question. So
who's inferior?
one answer would be, so the way, if we think about CMU versus UPET, I think most CMU students would see them as superior to UPET. Do you have students? Well, it depends. Actually, we might have the same. It depends on who you ask. I think you might have both. But if you think about sports, they clearly see them as superior. We are as more superior than the Duke students. So no, I haven't looked at that, and we didn't collect measures to ask, to prompt them and tell us something about the out-group members. I've done it in a different context where calculated not out-group and in-group memberships, but wealth, and see if there are differences in the allocation of resources, how do people react to that. But there were allocations that were not done, for example, on competence, so I'm not sure the finding will be relevant here. It's an interesting question, and I might expect some differences in terms of whether or not they see the out-group members positively. In a sense, however, the research on in-group and out-group memberships would suggest that you care, independent of what you think of your out-group member, you care about having this positive image of your group versus theirs. So maybe again, the fact that you view them as important or less important is a moderator, and you would still see the same effects. It's an interesting question. And the fact that you want to maintain this self-image for your group, you might have a bigger sense of threat in the case of a rival versus not. Okay, so in this case, what we told a few participants in one room is that they would be playing the role of allocators, and that their money, whatever was left in the envelope that they had, would go to people in the other room. In reality, people in the other room were engaging in a different study that was unrelated to this one. And what we did, we used confederates, and we made sure that the only participant in the session was sitting next to the selfish confederate. And we wanted to see whether the effects on the participants would be different if we had an in-group selfish confederate versus an out-group selfish confederate. So once again, we're using t-shirt. This is actually not our idea, but there is previous research suggesting that you can bring to mind this sense of membership, but just using t-shirts. So the confederate, so the experimenter went ahead and explained the instructions to the study after the initial bogus questionnaire, and the participants were sitting at a desk individually, and they had an envelope with money. And the confederate was asked to put the coins on the desk, put all the money in his pockets, and say, just whisper, I'm taking everything. So by using this design, we made sure that that example, that apple in a sense, was actually visible to the participants. And we were interested in this case in understanding what would the participant do after seeing the action of the in-group or out-group selfish apple. So as we expected, on the y-axis here, we're looking at how much money was left to the counterpart. So the amount, if we go, for example, looking at the out-group selfish condition, we see that people decided to leave less money for the counterpart than the in-group selfish condition. And this is data that suggests that there might be some initial support, at least, for our hypothesis. So in a sense, people were more generous and left more money for the counterpart when they saw their in-group selfish apple than the out-group selfish apple. Here, if you consider the $5 as a fair offer, we do see a statistically significant difference. And in the case of the out-group selfish example, is also the amount is below $5, even if, given that we didn't have a control condition, we are not clear on the fact that that's what people would do in a neutral type of environment. And there is some evidence suggesting that people not always give 5, but maybe they give 4 to the other party.
Yeah, why did you decide not to have a control?
We didn't think about the importance of looking at which of the two conditions is really driving the effect, and there is enough research to suggest that it's not too far away from 5, but it's not 5, at least for the Dictator Game. So in this third study, we find some evidence that is not consistent with study 1 and study 2. In fact, we see the opposite effect, suggesting maybe there is something about the fact that if there are out-group observers, our behavior is going to be different when we see an in-group member engaging in unethical behavior. So there is some compensation that might be going on. Now, in order to and the one that we use in study 1 and study 2 is not misreporting performance and taking more money than you deserve, but it's really being more or less selfish toward another person. So in study 4, what we decided to do is to use a 2x2 design where we are looking at the prediction of presence of outgroup members, presence of in-group members, and crossing that with our observers. So I'm trying to use colors to make it easier to digest. So we have in light blue the UNC people and darker the Confederate. And if you look at this design, what you can see is that the with outgroup observers is the same as in study 3, so the study that I just showed you, and the without outgroup, that's the same as in study 2. So we're using basically the same structure, and what we're varying is whether or not there are these observers that are perceived as in-group or out-group. In this case, we see what we predicted. So we see the reversal that we expected. So if you look at the without out-group observers, we see that we tend to follow the behavior of the in-group selfish example, and this is consistent with the results of the first 2 studies. But then when we are in the condition of out-group observers, we see the exact same behavior that we observed in the previous study. So we do see that there is some evidence that whether I'm just having dinner with Italians or there are also Americans, I might be thinking about tipping differently in a sense. So as I said, the studies 4 does give us some confidence that maybe there is a moderation effect that comes from the fact that out-group observers might be present at the table and not only in-group observers. Now, when I introduced this research, I was talking about the effect of associated guilt as a potential psychological mechanism that might explain why we compensate or overcompensate for in-groups members' bad behavior. So we ran a 5th study in which we examined the role of associated guilt. And given that we were interested in the psychological mechanisms, we used a scenario study instead of a real behavioral study. So in this case, we go back to the same design we had in study 3. So it's a simple 2 cells design in which we have the in-group and the out-group selfish example. And we asked people to read a scenario that was describing basically the study, the behavioral study that we ran. And we asked them to indicate, to imagine that they were part of the study and to indicate how much money they would leave for their counterpart, and also tell us what they thought about the behavior of the person who behaved selfishly. And we asked them to indicate whether they felt guilty and shameful of that behavior. Now, the scenario is right here, and I don't want you to read all this information, but basically the scenario was really written to describe the situation that we had in the lab study. And the only thing that we varied was whether the participants behaving selfishly was a student from UNC or a student from Junck. And again, we're building on this idea of rivalry in a sense. So what we see is that first of all, we do replicate the results of study 3. So once again, we see that there might be some compensation when there are out-group observers. But more interestingly, when we look at guilt, so this was a 1-5 scale. So in the in-group selfish example, even if we're just looking at a scenario, it does feel, it just seems like people are experiencing some feelings of guilt when they see an in-group member behaving badly, and less so in the out-group selfish example condition. And if you run a mediation analysis, we find evidence for the fact that this psychological mechanism of associated guilt that explain our relationship between exposure to a bad apple and selfish behavior. Any question on this? Okay. this first set of studies, what I told you before is that we have a different reactions to people's unethical behavior depending on social category and also social identity. And it matters not only how we feel toward the person engaging in unethical behavior, but depending also on whether there are people observing such behavior. Now, to the question that Shri was asking earlier, maybe there are other things other than in-group and out-group memberships. And with Evan Kaminsky, we started exploring the role of psychological closeness. And this is a mechanisms that you might experience in very subtle forms. So for example,